We'll wait one more minute for everyone to join. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Alejandro Campos. I'm the Executive Director of BritCham Argentina, and we are very pleased to host this webinar. And we are very honored to have the Professor Tom Hale from that will be our speaker from Oxford. But this webinar we are hosting within the Sustainability Committee of BritCham Argentina, and it's one of the sectors that we are promoting, and it's of a high priority for our chamber. I will introduce Manuel Frávega, who is the partner at Beccar Varela which is one of the main law firms in Argentina, and he will be moderating this event. So, Manuel, good morning, and thank you for joining today.
Good morning, Alejandro. Thank you very much. Bienvenidos a todos. Gracias por sumarse. Thank you very much. We are very happy to participate and to organize this event today within the Sustainability Committee of BritCham. And today, particularly, we are very happy to have the participation of the Professor Thomas Hale, who is Associate in Global Public Policy, Blavatnik School of Government in the University of Oxford, and Fellow of St. Anthony College. Professor Thomas Hale's research explores how we can manage transactional problems effectively and fairly. He seeks to explain how political institutions evolve or not to face the challenges raised by globalization and interdependence, with particular emphasis on environmental, economic, and health issues. As COP26 fellow, Professor Hale is supporting international negotiations in the run-up to the conference, and he is also the chair of the expert peer review group for the UN Race to Zero, the flagship COP26 campaign that engages with cities, regions, businesses, and investors in a drive for a low carbon recovery. He holds a PhD in politics from Princeton University, a master's degree in global politics from the London School of Economics, and an AB in public policy from Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. A US national professor, Hale has studied and worked in Argentina, China, and Europe. So thank you very much, Professor Thomas Hale. We are very happy to having you here and happy for joining. Thank you for joining us. We are very excited to learn about the scope and the goals of the Climate Policy Monitor of the University of Oxford that was presented in the last COP in Azerbaijan. The coming years are going to be very challenging in terms of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Countries continue to move forward with their commitments, and we see more and more regulations. The clearest example that all we know are the European standards within the Fit 55 framework, such as the CBAM and the UDR, among others. The Climate Policy Monitor is a very useful open access resource that helps us to identify and evaluate the main climate policies of our countries, and also give us the possibility of doing a quick benchmarking with other countries. So during this webinar, we will have the opportunity to learn more about this. Thanks to everyone who joined. Thanks to the University of Oxford for inviting Beccar Varela to participate in the development of the climate policy monitor for the Argentina chapter, that we did it also with our friends and colleagues from BritCham. And thanks to my team for their collaboration in this project. So at the end of the webinar, we will have space for questions that can be asked in both Spanish and in English. And well, the webinar will be recorded and uploaded to BritCham's YouTube channel. So thank you very much. And Professor Thomas Hale, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuel, and thank you, Alejandro, and to the British Chamber for hosting us today. It's really a pleasure to be here, albeit virtually. I had the great pleasure of studying when I was a student in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, for 1 year. It was a very interesting year. It now dates my age, but it was between 2000 and 2001. And that experience was a very important insight for me as a young student to think about how the world economy works and how we try to make it work better. And that's part of the motivation for this line of research that I'm presenting with you today. So as Manuel said, we are in this very complicated but important implementation era for climate policy. We have, of course, the Paris Agreement, which sets out a global set of targets, and countries have, by and large, put that global target into national targets, both in the form of their shorter-term nationally determined contributions, NDCs, which are a new third round of which are due next year, but also in longer-term targets, and particularly targets to reach net zero emissions by the middle of the century, either by 2050 or sometime around that point. And now we're in the hard work of trying to put that into practice, and the gap between the targets we've set and the policies we have and the outcomes we're trying to achieve is still quite large. So we have this big implementation gap. And even though there's a kind of global goal and a relatively well-aligned set of national targets, there's a lot of differences between the ways that governments are trying to institutionalize these targets into the rules and regulations and policies that structure the economy. And that's what we want to look at in this project, is to try to give the world a resource to understand how different governments are aligning different regulatory areas to climate change goals, where they're similar, where they're different, and how they can all be improved. And that improvement, which I'll say more about in a minute, is critical because to give you the final kind of takeaway point at the beginning, there's a huge surge of regulation around net zero, but it's still very initial, it's quite fragmented, and it needs to be strengthened, aligned, improved, made simpler and more coherent and effective if we're going to achieve our goals. So that's what the outcome we're trying to advance for this work. We start, and let me share my screen now to show you some of the results. I'm going to talk for 15, 20 minutes about what the results are, but I really would welcome any questions, comments people have, or how this looks in the line of work that you're engaged in, because part of the value of these kinds of events, of course, is not just to hear about some research you can find on the internet, but actually to have a conversation around it. So looking forward to people's comments and questions as well. Right, so hopefully you can now see my computer screen. Is that the case? And if not, just let me know. But the question we're trying to answer with this tracker is, what is the state of net zero regulation and policy? And as I said, it's not that simple a question to answer because this high-level goal is weaving through all different kinds of regulatory areas, both those that are kind of like explicitly focused on climate or energy or sustainability, and also others that are not necessarily called that, like procurement or corporate governance or financial regulation or other areas. And so we need to look at this whole picture. And that's what we're trying to do with the climate policy monitor. Of course, we want to know not just what the rules say, but also how they work in practice, how they combine, how they interact, what the sum total of the effects are. And so we need a deeper analysis as well. So how does the climate policy monitor try to do that? Well, it is based on a set of 30 jurisdictions, the G20 and others, covering 3 different domains in the first instance: disclosure of climate-related risks, so requirements on companies to disclose, say, their emissions or targets or progress or plans or those kinds of tools; transition planning, which are rules that require companies to lay out steps they're taking to align to climate goals; and an area around public procurement, so rules that how the government spends money, what kind of contracts governments make with suppliers, and how sustainability goals are being put into those. And that's an important one because government spending is probably about 10 to 15% of GDP in most countries. So it's a huge chunk of the economy. Of course, we want to expand beyond those three, but that's the three we started with in this first annual iteration of the monitor. So for those different areas, we go do a deep dive and we try to think, what are all of the rules, policies, regulations that pertain to how climate shows up in this domain? And for each of those different rules and regulations, we collect a ton of data about it, different aspects of rules that it has or doesn't have. For example, does it include scope 3 emissions? Does it include a temperature target? Does it include provisions for this kind of entity, say private companies? Or does it include this kind of provision for other sorts of companies like publicly listed ones? How all this detail applies is really important for how it matters. So you have something like 250 data points per regulation. And to get that kind of depth and understanding, and particularly the context around it, is absolutely vital that we as researchers or people using the data are able to draw on local expertise, local contextual knowledge, which is how people understand, what a rule really means in practice. And so the reason that this works is because of a network of 48 law firms around the world who have very generously donated their time and energy to allow us to collect this information. So thank you, Manuel, and to Beccar for all the work you've done, and also, of course, here in Argentina, Mucho Funes. But here's like a global teamwork that's come together to drive this to output. So huge thanks to everyone here. What do we do with the information that we collect? So as I said, it's not just about knowing the number, like the names of these rules and making a big list of them. But rather, what we try to do is to assess them for how they're a few different dimensions. And like I said, there's 250 data points per rule, but we group those into three broad categories. We're curious what ambition a set of regulation has, or how stringent, how ambitious is it in terms of climate policy? Is it really trying to drive toward aggressive decarbonization, or is it more moderate? How stringent is the rule? So is it mandatory? Is it enforced? What kind of verification requirements exist? What kind of data transparency requirements are there, et cetera? And then how comprehensive is it? Is it capturing a wide chunk of the economy, many different kinds of entities and actors? Is it including all sorts of emissions? How is it treating the role of offsets or other kinds of flexibility mechanisms, et cetera? So in each of these categories, there's lots of different ways to think about how a sort of ideal kind of regulation might look. We're trying to create a general framework that allows us to put the very heterogeneous landscape of climate rules and regulations into some kind of framework that's comparable. So that's the system we're using in the monitor. And by the way, I should have noted that this is all, of course, freely available online. So this is an academic research project that's created through pro bono activities from law firms, and therefore it's a public resource for everyone to use, for governments, for private sector organizations, for academic institutions, citizens. Anyone can use this information by going to the website and downloading it. Okay, so what do we find? So here's the first major point I want to make sure everyone takes away from this presentation, which is that the number of mandatory requirements for different sort of climate actions in law is really growing. Obviously we're in a moment of great heterogeneity and fragmentation where some governments are moving forward on climate policy aggressively, some governments are perhaps moving back the other direction on climate policy, and there's a lot of people in between. But if you look at the global landscape, you see actually a huge amount of new mandatory rules requiring different sorts of climate obligations in just the last year. And that's across the board. So Manuel, you mentioned the EU, of course, which many people have focused on given the stringency, ambition, and comprehensiveness of its rules and also the size of its market. But places like Turkey or South Africa or China or India, Australia, all show these kinds of rules coming into effect. So it's not only a European story. And of course, I should also add, we're looking in this work at national rules only because we have to limit the scope somehow. But in many countries and for many policy domains, subnational rules will be very important, not least in my own country, the United States. We see a lot of differences across different states, noticeably in California, et cetera. So regulation is happening very quickly. And even though there's going to be different governments that increase regulation, decrease regulation over time, the global picture is very clearly moving toward greater net zero regulation. But let's dive into a bit more detail here. So let's zoom in now on disclosure rules. We started with disclosure and transition planning in part because these are relatively widespread cross-cutting types of regulation, unlike, say, a sectoral policy, for example, in energy or in agriculture or in transportation, that might be more focused on a few sectors of the economy or more relevant for a smaller, like a certain set of countries for which that sector is important. These kinds of cross-cutting rules, disclosure and transition planning, are, we thought, a good comparison point because of their breadth. So we see quite a lot of variation here. So I guess following that point that there's a huge amount of rulemaking happening in disclosure and transition planning, there's actually a lot of differences between jurisdictions and the specific obligations that they're putting in place. So for example, if you look at this graph, you'll see that for something like disclosure of emissions, Argentina, as the top row, isn't something that we're seeing a lot of requirements here. Thank you, Manuel, for helping us fill out this data point. But then many other jurisdictions are requiring disclosure of emissions. However, other parts of the world are quite thin. So look at the United States, for example. There is a relatively high number of specific obligations on disclosing emissions for publicly listed companies and physical risks for publicly listed companies, but very few of the kinds of other rules that you have in the right side columns, for example, on developing and implementing plans and targets. That sort of more European style approach we don't see happening so much in the United States or indeed in some other countries. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in the specific obligations and rules and to which actors they apply. And so underneath that kind of high-level picture of convergence, there's actually, the detail shows quite a high degree of variability. I just want to call your attention to a few specific examples that may be particularly relevant to people here on the call. So obviously, Argentina is a case where relatively few of these types of requirements apply to a relatively few number of entities. In Brazil, we see quite a few more being required, and particularly duties for listed companies to demonstrate evidence that they're implementing plans and targets. It's quite an interesting facet of Brazil's new rules. In China and the United States, I think we have lots of interesting disclosure requirements, but with a fairly tight scope. So it's not necessarily a lot of different entities that are required to do a huge amount of things, but rather a smaller number of entities that have to do a smaller number of things, but with a very rigorous standard to which they're being held. EU, of course, is quite broad. Across, you see the whole row is green here. There's a lot of policies applying very widely there. But then some interesting ones I think people speak about a bit less. So India and Mexico, two jurisdictions that have adopted quite wide-ranging rules around disclosure, including to develop targets and plans, including to implement targets and plans. South Africa, Turkey could also be added to that list. And so I think we have, again, this kind of global trend where there are significant obligations. Okay, so that's quite enough just to show you the richness of the data and why it's really important to get to the detail. But what if we went even deeper and tried to think about this framework we presented around how ambitious, stringent, and comprehensive these different kinds of rules are? So the website and the data allow you to do this. They give you these kind of radar graphs that show for different specific areas how different jurisdictions compare. And so here's just a few examples to draw your attention to. And here we've mapped it with Australia, Brazil, the European Union, Mexico, and the US, and their main rules around disclosure, again, just because that's a good example for comparability. So in Australia, we see, in the EU, we see actually very strong requirements across these different areas. So they're at the outer edge of this radar graph all the way around. But then we see more variation on things like double materiality, which is the requirement to disclose not just the impacts of one's business operations, the impacts on your own business, but rather the impacts of your business on the people and on the planet. And that's an element that isn't part of rules, say, in Brazil or Mexico or the US, but is there for the Australia or the EU. And then here you'll see the bottom point is about enforcement. And that's, I think, a really key one, because you could imagine one set of rules where you have a narrow scope and narrow applicability, but strong enforcement, and another where you have much broader rules, but much weaker enforcement. And it's not clear which one of those is better for different outcomes you're trying to achieve, but they do vary a lot in that way. So this is, again, trying to help us understand the richness of the data. But the other point I would like to leave you here to reinforce the idea I was saying before about this is in its infancy. There are very, very few jurisdictions where we see many rules that are both ambitious, comprehensive, and stringent all at the same time across these different domains. It's really just a handful of countries, the ones you see listed here, where we see in each domain a sort of comprehensively strong set of policies. So there's lots of scope for growth across the world, and a lot of different nuance that comes into that. And this figure also kind of reinforces that point. It's looking at different kinds of specific obligations, for example, to have inclusion of scope 3 or independently verified data or net zero alignment. And you'll see that most of the mandatory policies we find don't include one or more of these specific regulatory requirements. So even though the rule might be mandatory in a general sense, the actual duty to do something is only there for a few of them. So let me just try to draw things to a close with some discussion of implications and what this means. So as I said, we see a real huge surge of regulatory activity around implementing net zero into a wide range of economic rules and regulations. And in some areas, like in disclosure, that's pretty universal, even though there's some variation in coverage, it's actually been widely adopted. But in terms of the details, like what specific obligations are mandatory, who they apply to, what specific obligations exist, how much they're enforced, what's covered, not covered, there's a lot more variation across jurisdictions, and that shows that this is very much in its infancy. I think the implication there is that if we want to get net zero regulation right, we need to do more work with governments to support them to not just put in place good rules, but also to improve the rules we have and to coordinate them better across jurisdictions. And if we get ambitious, stringent, and comprehensive rules put in the right way, I think there are lots of benefits to be achieved there. We can, of course, deliver climate goals more effectively, which is, of course, good for the world, but also reduces big source of risk for many businesses that have direct exposure to climate risk, but also have an uncertainty around what the direction of policy will be. More importantly than that, in some ways, for businesses, it also creates a level playing field. So it reduces this regulatory arbitrage that can be a source of business risk in itself, by providing consistency and stability that helps with business planning. And of course, that can also help be useful and indeed critical for building the right kind of enabling environment to make the transition economically attractive. And we see this, for example, of course, in areas like permitting reform to allow for infrastructure development to help companies meet their targets, providing renewable energy, et cetera. And if we get that kind of enabling environment and level playing field right, the big prize to be won here is to be able to unlock more investment into the transition. This is a picture you'll see here of COP29, where Emma and I and others on the team were a few weeks ago. And obviously the big topic on the agenda there was how do we finance the transition? And one of the outcomes was a goal of the language was call for $1.3 trillion per year to be mobilized for climate finance. And it's unclear how we're going to get there if we don't put in place the kind of regulatory environment that creates real incentives for finance to flow toward transition. So this is actually, this sort of regulatory discussion is, I think, actually a big finance discussion as well, because the one is needed to achieve the other. And of course, if we don't get this right, there's going to be a number of risks that will confront us. We'll have more climate change and therefore more climate impacts and more of the risks that are attached to that. But also we'll have greater uncertainty and really transition risk for companies. And I think that's particularly prevalent in a world where litigation around these questions is increasing in different areas, from fiduciary duty to public international law components to other forms of law which are being applied to both countries and companies. So that increases uncertainty and types of risk for companies. And of course, if we have a heterogeneous, fragmented regulatory regime, that can raise transaction costs, particularly for those areas that are most exposed to trade and to cross-border financial flows. And that will only increase. I mean, I was having a session of this with some colleagues here in the UK recently. I think some people are questioning whether, especially Europe and countries like the UK, will continue to pursue ambitious climate policy in a world where other governments are moving away from those commitments. And I think that my own take on it is that the politics are strongly aligned to maybe a slight softening, possibly, of their domestic goals, but only moderate, but a doubling down of some of the international so-called carbon leakage control mechanisms, so trying to promote regulatory alignment. And you see, for example, very far-right populist parties in Europe that are opposed to climate policy generally, but are strongly in favor of CBAM, or strongly in favor of making sure that other countries have to follow the same rules. So this is, I think, an important political reality that will create these incentives around working against fragmentation to the extent possible. So yeah, I think for businesses, many businesses might say, well, we prefer not to have any of this regulation because it's too complicated and difficult and costly to implement. But I think as the monitor shows, we're not in a world of no regulation. We're in a world of growing regulation. And so the imperative, to my mind, is to try to get regulation that works well, both for driving certainty and security toward the goals we need to achieve to have a stable climate, and to do so in a way that makes sense for businesses. And so there's this huge need for alignment and coordination that can help us push with smart, coordinated, well-crafted rules that can enable the transition to the new economy. So that's where I leave us, kind of where we want to take the work next. But I thrown a huge amount of information at you. So let me pause here and see what questions, ideas people would like to raise. As I said before, I'd also really like to hear how these issues look from your perspective. If you're coming from a company perspective or a law perspective or other contexts, that would be super interesting for us in the team to take back and consider. Final thing to say is this is all available to you right now and to everyone in the world with an internet connection. So feel free to go onto the website, play with the data, download it, give us your thoughts and feedback of how we can improve it going forward. I'll stop here and look forward to the conversation. Thank you. Manuel, back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Thomas. Very interesting. A lot of information. Thanks a lot. I don't know if someone wants to make some comment or question. If not, I have many. You can do it through the chat, through the Q&A. Perhaps to start, sorry, I'm seeing one comment. Okay. No, just one comment. I have two questions, Thomas. One is more related with the participation of the presentation of this climate policy monitor during the COP29. How it was, what was the goal, and what are the next steps of this project?
Thanks for that question. So the reason, this problem we've identified of how to understand the shifting landscape of regulation around net zero and how to promote greater convergence, not necessarily harmonization, but better synergy across the heterogeneous landscape, is one that many people have been focused on. And in so the last COP in 2023 in Egypt, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, launched this task force, net zero policy task force, which was an intergovernmental process, a sort of international process composed of different organizations like the OECD, the World Bank, the Financial Stability Board, these kinds of entities that are charged with thinking about economic regulation, and asked them to create a report about what is the state of net zero regulation policy and what processes can we have to better coordinate around this. And a lot of the demand for that actually came from many governments, especially those in the global south, who are seeing countries, jurisdictions like the EU put in place rules, and a bit concerned that there wasn't a global conversation around that. Even though a lot of these rules have extraterritorial effects, there isn't necessarily a forum that's charged with understanding those. There wasn't much progress in the World Trade Organization on these discussions or other areas. So this task force was kind of a way to have this conversation and support governments to do a better coordination work, but also to learn from each other and how they can implement more effectively. So that task force presented their report, which our data was the primary input to at this COP in Baku a few weeks ago, and that we were very happy to be part of that process. And where that's going next, and I'll answer your question, is the task force is now identifying a few specific topics that they're going to support governments to exchange on to hopefully get to a better place of alignment. One, for example, might be around nature, which is obviously a big topic people are worried about and thinking about. Also looking ahead to the next COP, which will take place in Brazil next year, and where nature will be a big part of the conversation.
Thank you very much. We have one question from Julian Costabile that says, great presentation, Thomas. Thank you. My question is regarding the regulations you mentioned in Mexico. Do you have more specific information on that or where to find it?
Yes, great question. So all of this data is available on the website. So I think in the chat, Emma's very helpfully put into the URL. So if you go on there, you can find the kind of global overview, but also specific country pages. And you click on the Mexico map in the country icon, you'll find the list of policies we're looking at there, and then our evaluation of those policies. The data on the website is organized in two different ways. So there's a kind of simple graphical overview for those of you who are interested just in the top level results. And then for the super users, you can download the underlying data and get all the original questions answered in their details. So both those tools are available for you. And a final thing I should say on this, one of the values of having an open source tool like this is that it can also, like Wikipedia, grow and evolve over time. So if anyone here finds something on the website they think is maybe incorrect or a gap that could be missing, that's wonderful, because we'll be able to incorporate that into our updates to the information. So this can also be a bit of a living resource that becomes more and more useful as people find it. That said, we're very proud of the work the law firms have done, so we don't expect you to find too many mistakes and errors. But there's a lot of interpretation questions, right? Like these are very complicated things, and reasonable, intelligent observers can come to different conclusions based on different interpretations. So that's also part of the conversation we want to engender with this work.
Perfect, thank you. Another question. I have here, that is in the chat, sorry. What is the expectation of the new government leaders in the US, UK, and Argentina on the matter?
A great set of questions around
A difficult one.
difficult one. I think we have Argentina government that's been in place for about a year, UK about half a year, and the US negative 2 months. But the point is that we're going to see, and we have seen, a lot of different political changes over time since countries have set these targets. I think my own view is that the kind of transition is inevitable, it's happening, and the question is not whether it happens, but how quickly it happens, and who and at what cost the benefits and losses of that transition accrue to. And that's where these kind of different political movements will be most important. I think let me start with the United States, my own country. The analysis I've seen and find most compelling suggests that the vast majority of some of the Inflation Reduction Act provisions will remain in place next into the Trump administration, because they have huge benefits for many constituencies that are very influential in the Republican Party, including local communities that are benefiting from new investments and factories and battery plants, for example, or oil and gas companies, which are benefiting from investments in carbon capture and storage and other kinds of things that are provided in the law. The part that I think is most at risk is the tax credit for electric vehicles, because Tesla is the most advanced, it has the most market share in the United States EV market, and therefore may actually have a benefit from not having that credit, because it'll be hurt its competitors more than it hurts Tesla. And obviously Tesla's owner is playing a key role in the new administration. So I think that, to my mind, is the most risky one, but other provisions I think will stay. The other thing that will definitely change in the Trump administration, I think, will be the rules from the federal government around clean air, rules around power plants, around vehicle emissions. I think those will almost certainly go away. They probably were going to go away anyway under the current Supreme Court composition. regardless of what happened with the administration. So I think that's the biggest fundamental change. But like I said, a lot is happening at the state and at the local level. And for the areas we were looking at around procurement, around disclosure and transition planning, what California is doing, what New York is doing, those are going to have huge implications for the market. So it's going to be fragmentation more than one, 0-1 kind of binary sort of outcome.
Perfect. Thank you. Very clear. I know we have another question. Perhaps I have a question related with the climate policy monitor, that is, during this first stage, we had an overview of some specific domains. The next step for next years, you will add perhaps other domains for the research. You are seeing a challenge in terms of updating the policies that we have already reviewed, taking into account these changes in the governments in some countries, because I think that is a challenge also, not only to first identify the rules, but also then to keep updated, to keep them updated.
Yes, that's exactly right. So our intention every year is to update the previous ones and add some new ones. And the updating, it's not that countries change these rules every year, but often they can change in interpretation or in practical effect. So for example, for many of the EU rules, countries are only now putting them into national implementation legislation. So that will be offer, a different path for enforcement and lead to some important differences in some of the details that we're very interested in. There's also lots of places where even though a rule might not change, it's all fixed, but there might be some litigation that comes forward that actually changes how it works in practice. And so that's something we want to capture as well. So yes, we'll be monitoring developments in these spaces. They are pretty dynamic, I would say. I don't think we can say, look at these areas and say, yeah, it's fixed. What's happened this year is going to happen next year. So we need to keep on it. I would love, Manuel or anyone, if you have any suggestions for us and what areas you think we should add. We have a long list of ideas. We have some favorites, but there's so many different areas this kind of tool could be helpful. It'd be very interesting to hear from your perspective, the perspective of people here today, where you would find this kind of approach helpful.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, interesting to hear from the audience what areas should track in the future years. Yeah. Some hot topic always is carbon tax, for example, or carbon market. We're having in our region a lot of bills related with carbon markets. Brazil approved a law some weeks ago related with that, and Argentina is discussing some bills on that as well.
Yeah, I think it's very much at the top of our thinking, that area. One of the other outcomes at COP29 was the resolution of the so-called Article 6 negotiations, which are the rules around which exchanges of credits or sinks between countries can be agreed. And my interpretation of the outcome there would be that they're a very wide range of possibilities. And that means that the substance of the rules will actually really depend a lot on what countries do to implement them. It's not going to be constrained very much by the international rules. And so that really puts a spotlight on how these different national rules are developing. And I think that's an important area to track going forward. I'd be curious as well, Manuel, you or others want to comment on this, what the long anticipated Mercosur EU trade agreement might mean for this area, because that's if it's been there for 25 years or something and come to a conclusion.
Yes, interesting. We will see. We will see what happens. It's a good news, and we will see how will be the implementation of that. I don't have so much comments because we are now studying the details, how this is going on. But I think for next year will be very interesting to analyze this particularly. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's through the detail of the text. It'll be very interesting to see what was finally concluded on some of the sustainability requirements, agricultural requirements. That's really where I think the friction points have been. So I'll be very curious to see what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Perfect. We don't have more questions. Please feel free. If not, if we will not have more questions, perhaps Thomas, if you can share with us some comments about the expectations for next COP in Brazil, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, happily. So this COP had the very important job of agreeing on a new financial goal for the world, which it did. I think, with the climate policy generally, but especially with COPs, kind of have to have two contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time. On the one hand, it's kind of amazing that anything was agreed, given the very difficult geopolitical context, some of the challenges around this COP in particular, some of the diplomatic disputes that were present in Baku. So it's kind of amazing anything came out of it. But it's all that should be seen, I think, as a very positive example that countries do want to cooperate, at least to some degree, on these questions. However, of course, the outcome is very far from what most observers would say is a credible and sufficient mobilization of finance to drive both the transition and also security from the impacts of climate change. The kind of high-level figure was 1.3 trillion to mobilize, but with a 300 billion commitment by developed countries to transfer to developing countries. But the quantity is really only one aspect. It's also about the quality of that finance. Is it actually available in the form of money that's useful? We're in a world where huge debt burdens are holding governments back from making positive investments in anything. And so in that context, it really depends what kind of finance you're getting. And that's not very clear in the outcome. It just says 300 billion of this sort of stuff. So there's much more detail to figure out there. For COP30, though, to your point, it would have been very difficult for COP30 to be successful if we had not agreed a finance goal this year in Baku, because COP30's main job is to be a sort of foresee moment for the third round of national pledges under the Paris Agreement, so-called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. We had first round in 2015, second round in 2020, then 2021 because of COVID. And now this is the third update of national targets. And we know that the gap between the previous round of targets and the national implementation is big. We also have to increase the ambition to get closer toward the goals we've set. And so that's going to be a huge question, particularly now, given the election in the United States, where the United States probably will not be submitting a new NDC, would be my guess. And so all eyes are going to be onto Brazil to show leadership on the international stage. How is it going to be helping the world get to this hugely important next moment? And in the context of Brazil, I think this is a really ambitious project for the government to undertake, to host it in the Amazon, to make poverty a main focus. These are very much aligned to the government's thinking on the world. And so there's a huge amount Brazil can offer here, but it's a big challenge for it as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm seeing that we don't have more questions. So well, thank you very much, Professor Thomas Hale. It was really very, very interesting. Thank you for your time and for sharing with us your thoughts and conclusions of this project, and congratulations for this great project that is really very interesting and useful. And we hope next year we can continue the discussion with more topics and with good news from Argentina and from the COP related with climate change. We hope so. So Ale, I don't know if you want to make the closing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuel, and thank you, Thomas, because really it was an amazing job, great information you shared with us, very useful. I think our membership, those who joined online and those who will take it from our YouTube channel. Surely they will appreciate all this information you shared with us. And of course, for everyone that is interested in having more information or have any questions that were not covered today, maybe they can write us to Manuel or to me or to the chamber, and we will send them to Tom to get the answer for those. So, well, as I mentioned in the beginning, sustainability is a very high priority issue in our chamber, and we cover different areas like reporting, like social issues, green finance, and climate change as well. It's some matters that we are always discussing within our members, and I think this type of events and lectures are of great interest and very useful for us. So thank you again. And well, thank you everyone that joined today, and well, hope you have a nice closing of the year in that beautiful Oxford City you're in, Thomas. And hopefully you come back to Argentina sometime to visit us.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. It'd be a real pleasure to come join you in person at some point and to continue the conversation.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you very much. See you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. Same to you. Thank you, Emma.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.